Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shivani Malhotra, co-founder and CEO of Positive Vibes Consulting, and a very warm welcome to all of you on our Leadership Spotlight series. Through this series, we bring to you insights by accomplished professionals who have demonstrated exemplar leadership in their respective fields and who continue to do innovative and path-breaking work and add value to the fraternity. And today I'm joined by one such leader who, in the true sense, is a maverick. Please welcome Harini Sreenivasan, or Hari of the Shiva Hari duo, Shiva being myself. Welcome, Harini.
Hi, Shivani. Hi, Shiva, or rather, that's what I should be saying today, right? It's wonderful being here with you this Saturday afternoon.
Awesome. And just to introduce Harini, though she doesn't need a formal introduction, I'm sure the fraternity knows her very well. But just for the audience here, so Harini is a pharmacist turned people leader, a behavioral scientist, design thinker, neuroscience enthusiast, and certified practitioner of various psychometric methods. She's adept in unlocking human potential in organizations. She has over 24 years of successful experiments in the areas of leveraging people potential for business excellence, a master storyteller, which is why she's here today with us, and a strong believer in driving's own destiny. She practices resilience as a life skill. Positivity and ability to drive engagement with people helps her to be an influencer both to the industry and academia. Currently, Harini is a partner with the Semco Style Institute India, and she's a very well-known keynote speaker at universities and B schools in India, and is mentoring dozens of students and professionals across the country. So I'm really looking forward to the session today. So today, Hari and Shiva, we are going to decode storytelling. So Hari, what do you think, would you like to tell the audience what is storytelling all about in business? It's become a buzzword these days, but I'm sure a lot of our audience would like to know what is the connection between storytelling and business.
Actually, the connection is very simple and straightforward. If you look at what business is meant to be, profits and revenues are byproducts, I would say. But any business, when you start, it is meant to add value to people, right? So the true spirit of entrepreneurship lies in adding value to the end customer. So who is your end customer after all? They're all people who is looking forward to getting that value from the business. How is it that you're able to add that value to people so that they are looking at it as the one thing that they have been seeking? I mean, that's how you define the business success. So when you have to get into people's minds, you have to get into their minds in a way that they're able to visualize things. And there cannot be a better way to visualize things than storytelling. So stories are the best way you get people to visualize. For example, even if you look at this conversation, how it happened, our paths crossed somewhere, and the moment we created the two characters, Hari and Shiva, we actually rolled out. I mean, we paved a new roadmap. We actually created a new roadmap of various things that Shiva and Hari can do together. A lot of our conversations went around visualizing Shiva Hari. So similarly, in business, whether it's a product or a service or any value that you're adding to people, if you're able to create a picture in their minds, then I think it makes a lot of sense for business. And therefore, it's a very straightforward connection. Every business is dealing with people. Every business has got to do with values for people, and therefore, storytelling plays a very big role there.
Absolutely. And I think I agree with you on the visualization part. It's a very valid point that you've made. And, an example that comes to my mind is that, as kids, we were taught moral science, right? There was a subject called moral science. And which we all
we hated the subject for giving exams, but we loved listening to those lessons. The exams part of it actually killed the stories.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So, one thing, is that if you tell a child, don't lie, always tell the truth. Vis-a-vis telling him a story about that shepherd, who lied, who cried, lion, lion, and then came into a situation where when the lion actually came, there was no one to help him. I think that resonates more with a child because of this whole idea of visualization, because the child visualizes himself to be that shepherd, and hence he doesn't want to be in that situation where he's crying out for help but nobody's helping him because he's a compulsive liar. So I think storytelling right from a very young age has an impact, because I think fundamentally as adults we understand a concept better if it is told in the form of a story, right? And my perspective here is also that storytelling concept has been in use by marketing teams in business for decades now. For example, Maggie, it's nothing less than an emotion for a lot of people, but it has now become a buzzword because now it's not only marketing that is using it, it's also being used internally within organizations to communicate with the internal stakeholders as well. So at the end of the day, stories inspire, but facts don't. Facts are boring, and stories make them interesting and more acceptable. So I think that's something that it's to set the pace of the discussion, right? It's all about visualization and imagining yourself to be there. So
Yes.
Very well thought out. But a related question is that do you feel storytelling gives a competitive advantage to a business?
Definitely. Any business which has a very compelling story to its purpose, when you're launching a business, if you have a very, very strong conviction about it, about why you're there, and that makes for a very compelling story. I think definitely those businesses have a competitive advantage over others. Now let's take an analogy. We all have learned so many theorems in maths. We all have learned so many principles in physics and chemistry. But what really all of us remember, I'm sure you pick up anyone who has studied science, and any one of us will remember this particular principle in science, where it's about an emperor in Greece who did not know, who had a doubt suddenly whether his crown was made of pure gold. He called the best mathematician in his kingdom and he asked him to prove it, whether it is made of gold or not. And the mathematician obviously had no answer, and he was worried about how he's going to face the king. He decided to go for a bath, and then he thought maybe he could find an answer, and he was just lost. He went for a bath, he filled his bathtub to the brim, and the moment he put his foot into it, the moment he went into the bathtub, a whole lot of water came out, and he ran around the streets absolutely naked, shouting, "Eureka, Eureka," the Archimedes Principle. And just imagine if we were taught the Archimedes Principle just by stating the principle that the volume of the water that is displaced is equal to the volume of the water that's immersed in the tub. Yeah, I remember this after 35 years. So, so you remember this principle because there's a story behind it, and the story was taught to us in such a visualizable manner that we could add characters into it. Even when Archimedes was said to be running around in the street shouting "Eureka, Eureka," we imagined him doing that, right? And that made us remember this principle. But believe me, this story was apparently written 200 years after Archimedes died. We do not know if this really happened, but some innovative teacher has built a story around it, and it has stayed with us. It has stayed with us now for centuries. I think my parents also must have learned it like this, and my children are also learning it the same way. So stories have huge impact on building credibility about facts which may seem incredible. So when it comes to business also, definitely businesses that have stories have a much longer way to go. So look at businesses that come with very strong convictions. Look at those businesses which are here to make a social impact. Look at the stories that they carry with them. In fact, a lot of the advertising campaigns that are very successful that you remember are the ones that have some stories. Now, either the campaigns are themselves relating a story, or there is a story associated with how that campaign was made. Either way, it sells. But it's definitely stories that stay. So if your business has a strong story behind it as to why it is there, and you're able to articulate that story, I think that definitely gives a competitive advantage.
Absolutely. And I think the Archimedes Principle is a classic example. It's also one of the reasons why most of us remember the meaning of the word Eureka. It means I found something. And that's because of, the Archimedes Principle, that the word Eureka has also become so so popular. Well, I think very, very relevant perspective shared here. I think today, gone are the days when people just buy something, whatever was available off the shelf. Today's customer is really spoiled for choices, which makes it very hard for businesses to compete, and make a place for themselves. So in a competitive world like today, I think businesses have to make a connect with the customers and, create a story that makes the customer resonate with the product. So right from, creating a need to understanding the motivators of the customers, the language that would resonate with your target group. And I think most importantly, triggering an emotion in your customers that makes them buy your story or your product or your service, whatever it is that you're offering. I think that is what is probably the magic of storytelling here. So
absolutely.
That's
so in the context of business. Once again, I'm just trying to recollect. Adding on to what you just said is, if you look at any of the products which have come into the Indian market from the Western world, imagine. So, for example, if you look at cornflakes, the food product cornflakes, which is not a very Indian breakfast, right? But when cornflakes actually came into the market, how were they trying to sell cornflakes? Is they started saying that this is a quick, healthy, nourishing breakfast. But it took a lot of time for them to really be able to cater to the Indian audience, because for Indians, for us, breakfast is meant to be healthy. We cannot do away with the aloo parathas and the idlis and the medu vadas for breakfast. And for people living in Mumbai, of course, it is vada pav. It is 6:30 a.m. You can see the stalls, with steaming vada pav. But somebody comes into this market with a completely different concept of a cold breakfast or a light, healthy breakfast. It's very difficult to sell. So they had to build stories around it. They had to build stories around, getting celebrities to endorse it, saying that this is used for people who are health conscious. This is used for people who are conscious about their weight. This gives energy. So they had to build these stories. Now, I mean, do you really believe that idlis are unhealthy? No. We constantly keep getting a lot of research which says that idlis are a lot healthier, or probably they are the world's healthiest breakfast, because there's no oil, there's no fat, and all of that. But yet, the story which talks about cornflakes being light and flaky and can transform your figure into a much more acceptable one is something which plays on people's minds. So selling the product has got to do a lot with storytelling. So it's not just about the product, it's about the story that goes with the product.
Absolutely. And yes, it's about, knowing the customer, what's going to trigger, his emotions, and that's going to make him take out his wallet and buy your product. So I think that's a very valid point. Now, coming to a very key point, we've talked about, what is storytelling and why do we, need to tell stories in business. Now, my, next question to you is, what are the key ingredients of a successful business story? How should one begin to weave it in a way that it gathers interest of the intended audience and keeps them engaged?
So this is a very simple technique. It might sound a little strange, but it's very simple. Now look at it this way: stories of Little Red Riding Hood, which you and I must have obviously we all heard, we read. At what age did we read it? And at that age, it made a lot of sense to us. We could relate with the wolf. We could relate with the grandmother. In fact, I remember as a very young girl, I was very timid. I was really scared when the story was told to me in a way, and I was wondering, why would a mother let her daughter walk across the forest to meet her grandmother? Life would have been so simple if both the mother and daughter went. So I started getting into the story at that time. Now the same story or a similar one, if somebody was to tell me today, okay, I would say this is such a silly story. It wouldn't even impact. So what is important is one of the things in storytelling is the plot itself, the plot of the story. Now, the plot of the story has to match the psychological age of the end user. So even in business storytelling, when you're putting across a story to your management, I can see my friend Rima with a question: how can HR use storytelling? So I'm just trying to blend some of the answers towards responding to a question. So when your target audience, for example, is the top management, and you have to make a business case for something to the top management, you cannot obviously you use a story which is not suitable to their age and maturity. You have to use the plot, weave the plot in such a way that they're able to relate with it, because you have to get them into the story. The whole idea of what happened in Little Red Riding Hood is, I felt the mother was unfair with the child. So, I wanted to be there and go and tell the mother that you're doing something wrong. Why don't you go with the child, right? So what is really happening is there is a plot. Within the plot, there are characters which are part of the story, but the listeners who are actually drawing insights from the story, or probably may even have to come up with some decisions, should feel that they're part of the story. So the story has to unravel in such a way that the listeners and every stakeholder feels that he or she is part of that story and they get into it. So there's the plot. There are characters which we will be talking about when we present a case. So in business storytelling, from an HR perspective, the characters will be employees, the characters will be managers, so on and so forth. But the other characters, or characters with whom people, the listeners relate to, are the people sitting in the room. So the plot and the characters are absolutely important, and they have to be aligned with who the listeners are. They have to be absolutely aligned with what is the end outcome. So plot, characters, a strong background, an outcome, and a visualization of the end results. What is it that you would see if you are, once you traverse this entire storyline? And I think the entire story has to be presented there with very clear distinctions in how characters come and go. And one very important thing about characters is it's great to create characters. So you should be ready to have as many characters that keep popping up every now and then, but it's very dangerous to kill any character. So maybe we'll talk about that a little later as when we look at what's bad storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to, also attempt answering Rima's question on how HR can use storytelling, I think there's a lot of storytelling that HR needs to do in order to able to attract very good talent. When you're working for a great organization, a big brand, it's not difficult to convince people to come and join your organization. But when you're running a startup, or let's say you're running a company which is yet to make its mark in the market, I think there's a lot of storytelling that you need to do to attract the people, good talent to come to you. You have to show them the value proposition. And value proposition is something, if it is, weaved around a nice story wherein you tell them about the organization's goals, its long-term vision, what's in it for them, most importantly, in the form of a story. I think that's what, attracts a lot of talent, a good talent, into a relatively lesser known brand. Secondly, hiring. Let's say if you have to hire someone who is coming at a 30% or 40% hike in today's time, who's not willing to join your organization and any money under that, and you have to convince your boss, it's going to be a difficult conversation to have unless and until you really weave a nice story around the value proposition that this candidate would bring in vis-a-vis the other one. So I think in HR, it is extremely important to do storytelling in various aspects. Storytelling
in HR is not, it's not about telling stories. It's about creating a visual impact of what the organization is all about. It's about creating that visual impact about how things happen in that organization. It's about creating a visual impact about the culture in the organization. So whether it is, right from hiring a candidate, right through the selection process, right up to the exit, the entire experience has to be, combined with a lot of conviction, because without conviction, if it is not authentic, that's where mistakes happen. So a lot of time people say that there's a huge mismatch between what I expected the role would be during the interview and what really is happening. That's probably something which went wrong, and probably too much of stories were told, but storytelling was not really used to drive home what is actually the culture. So that's where the mismatch happens.
Absolutely right. And I'd like to give a very simple example, and I think something with which a lot of us resonate. It is Bollywood. So all of us have seen, the movie called DDLJ, Dil Wale Dulhaniya Le Jayenge. Now, for a movie to run successfully for 2 decades in a Maratha mandir, what was behind that, story that odd generations. It's not about one generation of the 90s that we are talking about. It's about the people who were born after 2000 as well. And so what was in it that in that story which made it such a big success? I think that story resonated very well with different generations, because one, you were talking of a middle class girl wanting to be independent, something that most of the middle class girls of that age and even today aspire for. How they meet the love of their lives, a rich, handsome man, again, something that girls across generations would want, would dream of, and how the spoiled rich brat wants to marry a girl with her parents' consent and not by running away. Now, that's a classic emotion, I think, that most of the Indian parents and girls resonated with, and they found it awe-inspiring. So I think that's where the makers of the movie touched, and they evoke certain emotions, which is why people don't mind seeing it over and over again. So I think even in business, the story, whether it is HR, it is finance, it is marketing, the story has to have a key narrative that its target customers are either aspiring for, or they can closely relate to it. And most importantly, something that triggers an emotional connect with them. And one more thing, I'd like to just share a very different perspective here, that it's not always the businesses that need to do storytelling for their business. Ultimately, the aim should be that the customers do the storytelling for them, and customers become their brand ambassadors. I think that's where the success of a good storytelling in a business would.
Yeah,
think?
But how do you get your customers to become your brand ambassadors? First of all, you have to get your customers to be able to relate to characters or to become characters in the story. And how does one do that? Is when you talk about what is it that you are trying to sell as a business.
Yeah.
So even from an HR perspective, let me again go back to Rima's question and keep adding value to that responses. When you're trying to make a business case to your management as an HR representative, or when you're trying to make a business case of your product or service in the market as a business owner, either way, you're actually selling, right? So when you're selling, if your story is all about me and what I am selling and how my product has these features, how the policy that I'm making has these clauses in it, you're actually keeping yourself in the center or your business in the center. Yeah. So what happens is the customer or the end user or your target audience is someone who is looking at it from the outside.
True.
So so as long as the conversation happens in this mode, even if it is storytelling, obviously it is storytelling because everyone's brain is constantly making stories as you hear things happening. So when this happens, when the end user is looking at it from the outside, he or she remains a spectator. But the moment you weave the story, keeping the end user in the middle of it. So when you're creating an HR policy, when you have to sell that HR policy to your management, if you're able to keep your management in the middle of it and say that if we do this, this is how the organization is going to look like. These are the challenges which you're facing today is going to get sorted. This is how your life is going to look different, right? So if you're able to show the stakeholder a difference you're making in their lives, you're getting them into the story. The more they get into the story, as long as they remain as a center of your entire storyline, they're able to relate with what their life is going to look differently. The moment they're seeing that and when they start experiencing that future life, with these changes, they're already bought onto it. So the whole idea of how you engage, how you make your customers your brand ambassadors is make them part of your story. So if the story is if the hero of the story is the customer or the end user, I think that's where the success is. So even in HR storytelling, when you're using to present business case to your management, when you have to get approvals on certain proposals that you're making, storytelling as a tool definitely, and how you do that maybe we'll talk about it later. But it's about keeping the end user, the decision maker, at the center and weaving the story around how it's going to change their lives.
Absolutely. And I think that's how the whole buy-in of then in fact the management becomes an ally with you to roll out this policy to the employees, because you have their side, because you have their buy-in into the policy, because you've shown them the value proposition that your policy brings to them. So I think that's a
Yes.
Very valid takeaway here. So, just one example, if you could share with the audience of businesses that have succeeded, by successful storytelling, and what has worked for them in your opinion.
Right. So, talking of businesses that have succeeded with storytelling, I think there are many. But for the benefit of the audience, I wanted to bring about something which is, within a business, because marketing storytelling is easy to see. So wherever you see stories and advertisements, it does well. Wherever you see that the endorsements are done by celebrities, and you also see those products being good enough, they sell and those businesses progress. So let's look into what happens inside the businesses. Let's look at. I'm driving back to HR storytelling, and I'm trying to, because those are areas which everybody doesn't know. So let's look at how success and failure looks in such situations. So you have businesses which are going through downturns, right? So when a business is going through a downturn, but you still have to keep people motivated. That's a huge responsibility that comes on HR, because you are the people connect there. So how do you do that when there is a budget crunch, and you know that it's not easy to get approvals for things, but you need the money to keep people motivated? How do you get these things to happen? Now, if you go to the business head straight away and say that this needs to be done, your need is genuine, okay? But if you're articulating it as a need, something that needs to be done because there are people who are going to be impacted, you're stating the facts as it is. You will be having a lot of data as well, but when you're stating the facts as it is, you're not getting the decision maker into the situation, trying to understand what will happen if I don't take this decision. So what happens is, invariably, a lot of decisions people sit on, and there is a decision of indecision many times. Now, if you're able to articulate it using an effective storytelling way, where you're saying that this is where we wish our business to go in the next year, right? This is our strategy, this is our roadmap, and if we want to get there, these are the challenges we are facing now because of the downturn, and these are going to be the roadblocks that we will face before we get there. Now, if we have to manage these roadblocks, if we have to navigate through them, if we have to really emerge there, there's some struggle, and we have to do the following things. And when we do the following things, this is going to give the kind of result that we see. And then before you know, these roadblocks will be out, and there is a way for us to manage it. Now, when you weave your entire business proposal through this, of course, with a lot of data. Of course, data is important, because you cannot be talking in the air and giving a fairy tale story. That won't work, because your adult audience is not interested in a fairy tale story. So
that's telling stories.
Telling stories.
Stories and not storytelling.
Absolutely. So storytelling is a tool. It is a method of communicating. It's a method of putting your point across. It's not about telling a story and relating it to something. So whenever so within businesses, which are those? So if you look at successful HR leaders, how is it that they have been able to turn around the business when the business was going through a rough patch? Is they have been able to communicate strategy, the people strategy to the business leaders. They're able to drive the business. They're able to sit on the driver's seat and take it ahead, because they've been able to put the business and its need at the center of the story. So it's all around what is your plot, what is the end outcome, and how you're making your end outcome visible to the business leader, and then those are success stories. So if you look at any of the successful HR leaders, if you look at any of the successful business leaders, if they've been able to put themselves as part of the story, I think they have been success stories. But if you look at really businesses that have done well using storytelling, look at any of the marketing ads, if you look at any of the advertisements where there's a very strong recall, either because it is a story itself, or there is a story associated with it, then those are brands that do very well. So that's about bringing business ahead.
Yeah, in fact, this thing about data, there's a very nice comment here saying, I believe stories give life to data. And that is so true, because data and facts and figures are so uninspiring and so, like on the face. But if you add a story to it, suddenly they become inspiring, and they become they sound more authentic. So that's
Yes.
that's
So
a great.
even the Archimedes principle, well, like I said, we remember this one very, very
Yeah,
well because it's a story associated with, and
absolutely.
it doesn't matter if the story is genuine or not in this case, right?
Absolutely. And one of the businesses in the latest in these COVID times, I think that has really demonstrated a great example of what I previously mentioned, that we should ultimately aim at our customers telling stories about themselves, about our business, is the Airbnb example, where they have in times like COVID, where people don't want to stay in crowded places, their customers are telling the world about their safe and affordable homestays with a Wi-Fi facility to work from wherever you are now. That's quite powerful. And it's a classic case of how storytelling can actually turn around your business, even in a tough economic scenario. So that's a very recent example that could come, I could think of when I was thinking of this question, that nothing like your customers talking about how cool you are. So
Absolutely.
that's the power of
No,
good
I think
storytelling.
look at it in the organization's context. When I look
Yeah.
back at a lot of my work that I've done in organizations in the past, there
Yeah.
are people who still come back to me saying that, you created that policy, you created that model, and it is still alive, and we call it the Harini's model. So what has actually happened there is, if something is outlived you, it is a story.
Yeah. It's
So
this
if
absolutely.
you're able to, yeah, if you're and how it is outlived you is people who are users of it, who have never met me, people who have joined the organization after I have left, they have experienced it and they have heard it from their predecessors and from people who have from my times who have been telling them. And when they're hearing those stories, it's a lot of validation. And when that validation happens, obviously the customers are there to talk about your story.
Yes.
So while you're
Yes.
bringing an external context, I'm talking
Yeah.
about what happens within
Internal.
organizations as well. Stories which are authentic, stories that are value adding, and any process, any policy, anything that you have done which has added value to people, and there are people to validate that, and those are the biggest testimonials of successful stories. So those characters live on, and
Absolutely.
more characters keep getting added.
Yes. It's all about the people, the place, the plot, and the purpose, like what they say are
Yes,
the four
yes.
fundamental, pillars of storytelling. Okay. So now, Hari, I'm going to now put the elephant on the table. Okay. How do we make sure that our story doesn't turn around from Little Red Riding Hood to Little Red Rotting Wood? In other words, when does storytelling become more disastrous? And, how does one ensure that it does not happen? Uh, when can stories
Okay.
become really a disaster?
Actually, it's very interesting. So let me bring a little bit of neuroscience here. Our brains are always, they keep constantly forming and deforming stories. Brains are constantly looking, our brain is constantly looking at things, assimilating information as we observe, and it's constantly creating a story. It's erasing some stories of the past, it's recreating stories. So that's happening as a continuous process, right?
Yeah.
So let me take an analogy of what happens in the courtroom. Okay, so in the courtroom, you have two lawyers who are advocating for two opposite parties, and there is a judge. The judge has to take a decision as to what is right. Now, many times we have seen in a lot of court cases, we have seen that someone who has actually done wrong has been acquitted. And a lot
Yeah.
of us know that, yeah, this guy was at fault, but he was the accused. But how did this acquittal happen? Of course, there are lots of theories about what happens under the table, behind the screen, so on and so forth. But I'm not getting to that. I'm saying, assuming that there has been no corruption in that scene,
Yeah.
assuming that the judge has been, absolutely righteous in listening to both sides of the story, listening to what the witnesses have said, and then giving the judgment. Still, it has
Yeah.
happened sometimes that a judgment has gone in favor of someone who we all think should have been accused and should be punished. How did that happen? It's how does a very efficient, successful lawyer actually get the case on his side? Is even the sequence in which the witnesses are presented, the sequence in which they are brought in, the timing at which they are brought in, the kind of questions they are asked in what sequence, all of those actually make stories get formed in the minds of the judge. So when the
Right.
judge is constantly forming those stories in his or her brain, the decision is getting influenced by those stories. So it's not necessary that only the righteous might win. It's about how you're putting the case, right? So storytelling is a tool because the brain is constantly forming stories. So in the business context, what disasters can happen is if the timing is incorrect. If you're trying to use storytelling as a tool for a situation which does not need storytelling. Now, I need something to be quickly looked at, and I do not have enough data. I have to go with a feeling of gut. Now, I cannot use storytelling here as a technique. So that's
Yes.
something where I try to get into. So with storytelling, like I saw one of the comments here, I think it was from Prashant, that it gives life to data. So without data, if I try to use storytelling, I'm trying to give life to something which does not exist, which is meaningless. So when a listener to the story asks for more information, if I don't have data to back it up, if I'm not able to unravel the story with conviction, it's disastrous.
Yes.
If I am using a storytelling style which is not appealing to my listener, it is disastrous. If my listener is someone who believes in a lot of, who gets influenced by what others are doing, I need to give him a lot of benchmark data. My storytelling data points should have a lot of benchmark, which is a kind of validation to the proposal. Now, if my listener is someone who would like to see only the end result. Now, suppose my listener is someone who wants to read the last chapter first. I have to be able to position it in such a way, right? So with that listener, if I go on if I start talking from where we are today, spending a lot of time on the background, so on and so forth, then that person is going to lose interest, and obviously he would have just removed this conversation from his mind, and it's going to head nowhere. That would be a disaster. If my listener is someone who believes in a lot of data, and if my storytelling style is extremely philosophical, very fluffy, with no data, obviously that would turn into a disaster. Let's look at telling stories, for instance. Like if I am telling a story, it depends on what genre the person is interested in. If I am telling a thriller or a horror or a mystery to somebody who loves to listen to a love story, a romantic story, then that storytelling would be a disaster. That person will say you're a horrible storyteller. You can completely upset somebody, right? And if there is someone who has no patience and wants a fast-paced story, and I'm taking that person through a musical, now that person is going to lose patience. I think one of the important factors of how you don't damage a good business case is by understanding what is the psyche of the listener. Now, who is your target audience? That's important. It's important to understand what is it that will appeal to that person. And no matter what the business case is, your entire storyline has to match with that. That's one. The second thing that can go wrong is when you create characters. And if those characters are, the moment you create characters in your narrative, the listeners are relating to those characters because their brains are also constantly forming stories. So when they're forming stories, they're listening to your characters, and suddenly out of the blue, you killed a character. You killed that listener. So you have to be very careful that you don't abruptly kill any character. So look at it in any of those soap operas which were a rage a few years ago. When some character was killed because that actor refused to continue, it became a rage. People started getting uncomfortable. Because people started feeling that I am relating to that character. You killed me. So imagine in a business context when you have this audience with you who has to give you a decision, and in your storytelling narrative, you've killed one of them. One of your decision makers is gone. So he's going to be someone I'm not going to approve what you're putting forth, right? So it's very important that you don't kill characters abruptly. If some characters have to become redundant, give them a graceful death and a decent burial, but don't kill them abruptly because you could be killing one of your listeners. So having and the third thing which is important and which can make stories a disaster is the length of the story. You cannot have a business story which goes on like a 20 episode serial. A business story has to be extremely crisp. It has to be like one of those short punches where it should be like one of those very short stories where you're leaving the listener at the end with a thought-provoking question. Now, if you're giving all the decisions, you're giving everything at the end, they will just listen to the story and they'll just walk away saying, yeah, wonderful story. I mean, wonderful proposal. But if you're leaving them with a question, where they've already got them into the narrative, and you're leaving them with a question, they'll probably leave out with a decision or a decision of giving a decision at least. But if you weave a very long story, and you're giving everything right from the problem statement to the decision, and you're leaving nothing with them to think about, then you're actually deflating them. They're sitting in a position of authority where you're asking them for a decision, and suddenly you tell them that this is what it is. Now please sign on the dotted line. They may not like it. So these are all various aspects where the moment you start thinking about your end user as as a center of your story narrative, it works. But the moment you start looking at them as a listener, as a mere spectator outside a narrative, it becomes a disaster. So these are points where stories go horribly wrong and nothing comes out of them.
Absolutely. I think it's a very interesting point. One should actually, try and put, one of the things is that you try to put yourself in the shoes of the person, whom you are targeting, and think from that point of view, that if you, try and sell whatever concept, whether it's a product, it's a proposal, whatever you're trying to sell them, had you been in their shoes, would you accept it? And for that, you need to know them well. So going back to your point that you need to know your audience, you need to present a point of view in a way that engages them, keeps them interested, and most importantly, I think drives them towards a specific outcome that you want to achieve, or make them believe in something that you want them to believe. That's probably the key line that you need to, keep in mind if you don't want stories to go disastrous. Any particular examples that you'd like to give, Harini, of a bad storytelling in a business? An example of a disastrous story that destroyed a business case? Any particular examples?
Yeah, actually, yes. There have been a few, while I was still experimenting this art of storytelling, and I just wanted to. So wherever there was the consequence was not too bad, it's quite easy to experiment and fail, because it kind of validates your hypothesis. So there was a situation where we had to get into. It was a bit of a crisis situation. I think it was something got to do with an insurance of a renewal of an insurance policy or some such thing. And that was a decision which was needed to be taken then and there, right there immediately, because the policy was due for renewal that midnight. And we had some cases that need, that policy the next day for a surgery that was scheduled and something of that sort. And at that time, I was actually trying to experiment if I can use a storytelling way to convince management about slightly changing the contents of that policy. But what was really required there was an urgent decision. So, that was a disaster, because I actually rubbed people the wrong way when I started building in a lot of situations where I wanted them to empathize. I wanted them to understand what was it. I wanted them to visualize a lot more. And I realized that I was losing track of time. So this was one case where, I actually ended up, ruffling people's feathers. I ended up earning a lot of flack around it, because what really came out was not about the urgency of the situation, but what really was pointed out was that there was a delay from our end. So while we were very, empathetically gathering facts and, building a lot of muscle around how to make this an absolutely sellable proposition, of course, in the interest of the people and the organization, the intent was very clear. But the way we took the timing, we actually took a lot of time to build that background and that foundation, whereas it was something which should have been treated with a sense of urgency. So we built a fairy tale, we built a tragedy drama around it, but it was meant to be something which is like an action movie. So using the wrong genre there, with the wrong sense of timing, that was a disaster. There have been moments where we brought in comedy, and it turned out to be a disaster because the audience was not prepared for comedy. We were evaluating two proposals, and I wanted to lighten the moment, and I was trying to use a lot of visually impactful slides, but the audience there was not really interested in looking at that. They wanted to look at only hardcore data. So using the wrong genre sometimes really damages a business case. And there have been a couple of such proposals where, of course, not very impactful. So I was okay about failing, but those definitely validated the hypothesis that timing, the genre, and the audience is absolutely important for storytelling in business.
And I, tend to agree with you on the, audience, the genre, because I've had a similar experience in one of my previous organizations where, there was the employee engagement survey that we used to do every year, and we had to present the scores of that survey to the people. Now, the person who was at the helm of the affairs at that time was a very numbers driven person. So he made us, work on a lot of numbers, graphs, and high level, stuff. And we had to present it to the entire office. Now, the entire office has people from different backgrounds. Not everybody understands that kind of while it may be a very flashy looking presentation, but when we presented it to the people, it just bounced back. So the next year we tried telling it in a more simpler way in the form of a story, wherein there were no numbers, very few basic numbers, of course, because we had to tell them the scores, but no graphical representations. In fact, we used a lot of visuals of people there. And that's what worked well. And we got very good feedback that this time it was, something that we could understand and we could give our inputs also, because in the previous meeting, nobody knew what to say. So I think it's very important to see the kind of audience that is there in your organization, what kind of a story would resonate, what kind of a language would also resonate. Sometimes it's about the language as well.
Absolutely.
It's not just about what you were saying, it's also about how you were saying it. So I think these are small things, but they make a lot of difference when you have to make sure that the story that you want them to believe in, they do believe in it and take up what you are proposing to them. Great. I think we have some more time before we take on the audience questions. So, one question is that to be an effective storyteller, does one need to have a knack for it, or can one develop storytelling skills? And if yes, then how?
Okay, this is interesting because as a child, I wasn't very articulate. Rather, I was very timid. So I would hardly speak up much. I was a very withdrawn, very, very quiet child, but very compliant with everything. So nobody would really catch me doing something wrong. But as I grew, as I went out into this big bad world it has been really, I noticed that it is, it was like the Red Riding Hood. I noticed that wolves are around, but that's when I realized that it is important to learn to articulate. It is important to be able to put across your point very well, and not only in defense of yourself, but to actually make your way, right? So storytelling is, like, if you ask my children, they will tell me that you've never told us any stories when we were young. So I am not a natural storyteller by that definition. But when you've decided that you have to have your way by navigating through people's minds, you have to start developing this skill. And storytelling, like I said, it's not about telling stories. It is very simply about learning the art of practicing empathy. The moment you start practicing empathy, you're able to visualize your entire conversation through the lenses of different people who are listening to it. I think you become a storyteller. But where things go wrong is we want to become storytellers. We want to use storytelling now because that is a buzzword these days. We start copying a lot of stuff. And that's where things go wrong. If it is not my way of conversation, if it is not my way of talking, if I need to prepare, if I need to go with a structured presentation, if that's what works for me, I should use that. I can use storytelling through those. Now, if I am comfortable speaking extempore, if I can think on my feet as I speak, great. If that works for me, I do that. So it's important to find out what is your best the pedagogy that you would use, the methodology that you would use, and storytelling can be interwoven. So you don't have to be a born storyteller. You can develop as long as you're able to develop the art of empathy. So that's how I would put it. But it's very important to understand what others want to become a storyteller.
Absolutely. I think the key again is to know to know the people that you are going to tell the story to. And
whether in your role you really need to know the people, right? So that makes you a storyteller. The entire need comes from what's your purpose? Why are you there?
Absolutely. No, a lot of times, how I do it is that there is a lot of data and figures that I want to say. And I would think that if somebody was to present these data and figures to me in the way that they are, would I be interested to listen to them? Would it be impressive? No, I won't be convinced. So how is it that I can weave a story around it? So maybe once we start thinking about even the small things that we do day to day at work, for example, for a meeting that we are going, how is it that we can articulate our thoughts better? I think it comes with practice, and it's something that definitely, people can develop over time and experience in their...
definitely comes with practice. And while you're practicing storytelling as a tool, it's also important to observe the audience reaction, how they take it, draw those trends and patterns, analyze them, go back, review it. In fact, a lot of times in my past few decades ago, maybe at least a decade ago, I used to go back and read my emails, which I have sent out to people. I used to go back and analyze them, why some emails were amazing and why some emails were terrible. Those are all aspects of storytelling, right? So, because all our interactions with people, because everybody who reads an email is forming a story in his mind. So why some things went well, why some things went wrong. It's very important to critically evaluate oneself and what you've done in the past. That also adds to becoming an effective storyteller. So it's one has to be a critique of oneself as well.
Absolutely, yes. You have to view yourself from a critique's lens. And that's when that's what holds true for public speaking as well, right? It's the same thing that you practice, and then you see, you critique yourself, and then you become better. I think it's the same thing that goes with storytelling as well. Super. I think we have some questions from the audience now that we have a little less time in hand. So one of the questions is, what could be engaging triggers or keynotes for my audience during storytelling process?
Okay, so this question is from Pankaj, right? So Pankaj, for when you're doing a keynote address, I think some things the things we should not do is never start with "let me tell you a story." That's a disaster, because adults believe that we don't want to listen to stories. So the introduction of the story has to be very subtle. So the moment the story introduction is subtle, your audience is engaged. And how do you build how do you make that subtle? Is a lot of time you can use personal stories, so people are always curious to listen to what happened in your life. So anything that is relevant to the context of the keynote speech from a personal, storytelling perspective, that will be a great idea. That works very well. And how else you can keep people engaged is, as you bring some characters alive with eye contact, you can make out which character is keeping the audience, is brightening up somebody's eyes, is lighting up somebody's eyes, and that character is something which you can build on in your story. Make that character the central character, because it's somebody's able to relate with it. So a lot of these eye contacts to be used when you're developing your characters, as your characters are growing in the story. So, for example, in some conversation, somewhere when I was teaching a class, I wanted to bring out a concept very simply. So I introduced a character called Anamika. And that Anamika character now has overgrown me, and people look forward to listening to Anamika in the story. So, when you're bringing across a complex concept and simplifying it by using a character, that character becomes very strong, and that character becomes associated with you as a keynote speaker. So the next time you're going to some place, you will invariably bring out that character, or people will look up to you. So, for example, if you've heard Sadhguru, very often, suddenly in the middle of a conversation, he will say, this is so Shankaran Pillai was one afternoon sitting at home, was sipping a cup of coffee, right? So you're not looking at who's Shankaran Pillai, you've never heard Sadhguru's earlier talks, but you can still relate because there is no connection with the previous talk. But the character is suddenly born and people latch onto it. So in keynote speaking, if you're able to introduce a character like this, people latch onto it, and it's a lot better than saying, let me tell you a story.
That's true. Very true. I think the moment we use the word, let me tell you a story, people think it is going to be a story that we tell them. So it's like telling stories and not storytelling.
Yes.
I think that's a pretty interesting perspective. One last question, Harini, before we close is, do you think businesses or brands sometimes overdo stories? And how can they ensure that they don't go in for an overkill when they're trying to tell stories?
Yeah. So, and overdoing of stories happens when the story becomes bigger than the value itself. So, if you look at any brand where the story is bigger than what people derive out of the product or service of the company, then its story eventually starts getting killed. What is important is the authenticity. As long as uh, there is authenticity in the story, as long as the story is truthful, as long as you're able to see that the story coming into play in the actions, in the product itself, it works very well. The moment you find that, oh yeah, I saw this, now when I'm looking at it, I realize that the whole thing is just a story, then it just bombs. For example, if another thing is, if you're not able to keep up with the quality that you once started when you built your original story, it bombs. Now look at a lot of those brands which have disappeared, a lot of those services which have disappeared. When the fleet taxi started, Meru cabs were the first ones to start fleet taxi. Where are they today? They spoke about a lot of comfort, a classy chauffeur service, cab at your doorstep, impeccable quality, amazing, the best possible professional behavior by the drivers, and so on and so forth. But at some point, the story remained, okay, and that story was caught on by a lot of competitors who started adding authentic value to that story. The moment the value here dropped, the brand disappeared. If you look at it, there were so many brands where we probably might remember the story, or there are others who have caught on to the story, but that brand disappeared because they couldn't deliver a value that lived up to the story. So it's very important to keep synchronizing the value delivered to the story. Only the story as well as the brand remains alive.
Absolutely. I think the point of trust that you mentioned is very, very relevant. And in fact, a recent example, a recent incident of the Realme mobile. So for people who don't know, Realme, a mobile phone company, wanted to launch their new mobile. And so they organized a live gaming event. Now that's a powerful platform to weave a story around how how good your phone is by demonstrating it practically, live, its capability, speed, etc. But the disaster that they did was they used an Apple iPhone instead of their own phone in the gaming event, showcasing it as their phone. Now that's a big disaster because you're denting the trust of the customer already. And imagine what kind of an impact it would have had on the psyche of the people who would even think of, buying your product. So I think the trust factor is absolutely important in a business. You tell a story, but you tell it with authenticity. That's when people take it, they take it at the face value. So great. I think we could just go on and on, but it's that there are time constraints, and it was a wonderful conversation, Harini, with you, and I thoroughly enjoyed it myself. And thank you so much for coming on this platform and having such an engaging conversation with us on a very interesting topic, storytelling.
Likewise. So storytelling has been a favorite topic of mine, and I think it was fun being on this leadership spotlight with positive vibes. And I think Shiva Hari is an interesting way it all started, and looking forward to more such conversations. Absolutely. And thank you once again for having me.
Thank you, and thanks to the audience as well who joined us, on a Saturday afternoon. I'm sure you found this session insightful, and we'll be coming back again with another interesting session very, very soon. Thank you, and have a great weekend ahead, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Stay safe.